Sunday. This Sunday and next Sunday, we're going to be looking at the whole language. How many people in here have read any of Father Gregory Boyle's books? So a number of you. How many read Tattoos on the Heart? Okay. Barking to the Choir. Okay. And the whole language. So we're gonna get at that today. So I must say just up front, this has really been hard to prepare for because there's so much good stuff in the book that otherwise we'd be here a month. So I don't know how far we'll get, but anyhow, I think the book is really good. And so let's see here. There we go. So there's the book. You can get it at Amazon or anywhere. And so one of the questions I've thought about as I reflected on, prepared for this, is why has this book touched me and I think many others in one of our small groups? In our small group, sometimes we don't finish the first book we start. We finished all 3 books, each one saying, "Oh, we got to have another." And so why has it touched me and others so much? So I don't fully know the answer to that, but obviously he's had 3 books. Just a little bit of why I am teaching this. So Linda's a part of the group. It was the Dream Team. I'm not sure what it's the implementation team now, but Matthew 25 and the whole issue around True Love Church, TLC Church, and our work with them and counseling and a bunch of other things. This issue of how do we respond to the least of these, it goes back couple of years. We started out really focused on racial justice and has evolved into what we're doing now. And so Linda had said, well, it'd be really great if we study this as a part of the initiative. And so I said, well, I'll be willing to do that. And so, but in the process, the whole church decided to read Tattoos on the Heart. And we had several small groups, maybe many small groups reading that. So I said, okay, I'll do this 3rd book. And having read all of them, it's not like if you read the first one, the 3rd one doesn't work. It really does work. So strategically for the church, this ties to this major initiative where we're really talking about what can we do to serve the least of these. And obviously this book focuses on Los Angeles gangs, and that fits right in. But I think that this question, I'd just like to throw it open, just a word or two. Why has this really resonated? What has stuck out for those? How?
To me, he writes with one simple thought in each chapter, and then the entire chapter is about his real life experiences making that point.
Yeah.
It's not, you should do it this way, or I think we ought to do it this way. This is the way I've done it.
Yeah, it is very experiential in the moment of what they've done. And to me, that just lends such authority to it, because it's not a woulda, shoulda, coulda theoretical. It is, this is what we've done. Great point. What else? What stood out about the book? Anybody else? Anything else?
Process that maybe not the beginning, but it can be the homeless. It can be really unserved or
Yes.
Anyone that feels like they're on the outside.
Anyone on the outside. And when we abstract it up, and I want to tie it that way today, is we are all gang members. We have all been wounded, and he deals a lot with woundedness. So we haven't, many of us, most of us, not wounded in the way the severe stories that we get, but we still carry our wounds around, and those wounds show up in our lives, and God shows up to help us deal with those. So we're going to deal with it really on 2 levels. The horrible things that many of those gang members have both experienced and things that they've done, and how those same issues are present in our own lives. So we're going to deal with that. So anything else that stands out, Linda? His humor is just, it is just great. His humor, every page, there's 3 levels. There's some you kind of smile to yourself. you smile, kind of visually, and then you just laugh out loud. It is really funny. Yes.
Yeah, he just doesn't preach. He talks to him.
Yeah.
Gets the message across.
Yeah, yeah,
in a
yeah,
easy way,
yeah.
gentle way.
yeah, yeah. Bob?
There's not a father figure involved in the majority of
Yep.
people who talk.
Yep, yeah.
No father involved.
So he and Homeboy Industries is a father, and then it ties to our father. So very powerfully done. So anyhow, if you haven't read it, really recommend it. So just some background for those who aren't familiar. He's a Jesuit priest. He was a chaplain at Folsom Prison and was pastor in Dolores Mission Church. It's the poorest Catholic parish in LA. And he started this around 1988. By 1992, they were having 1,000 gang-related deaths a year. 1,000. Just soak that in. 1,000 gang-related deaths per year. So he's in the middle and has been in the middle of a very difficult place. He's the founder of Homeboy Industries in '88, largest gang intervention, rehab, and reentry program in the world. And you may know they have a bakery, they have a cafe, they remove tattoos, they do counseling, they do a bunch of different things, kind of dealing with the whole totality of what gang members who are wanting to get out of the gangs are dealing with. Tattoo removal is a big one. In LA, there's 11,000 gangs and over 86,000 members. That is by most counts on the decline some, but at the peak, that's how prevalent it was. And they at Homeboy Industries estimate they serve about 8,000 people a year. Now they do that in a lot of different ways. Not all of them are gang members that work there or whatever. And obviously one of the overlays is many of the different gang members that are there are in gangs that are very hostile toward each other. By hostile, I mean they kill each other. So we think we have challenges in a church, kind of getting the progressives and the conservatives and so forth together. To date, we've had no one kill anyone or stab anyone here. That could change, but today. So, and in the police precinct where they are located, 60 gangs with about 10,000 members. So a tough neighborhood.
Yeah, how that compares like New York City or Chicago.
I've wondered that. I don't know if anybody does know. My sense is they have a greater concentration there than most, and my sense is it has subsided some. But you look now at gangs that are coming also from Mexico and other parts of the world. Recently, the Chinese gangs have gotten some notoriety. So I'm not sure we know. There was just a piece in the news this last week in Oklahoma, which was one of the early ones for medical marijuana. And they're saying now that about 3/4 of the marijuana grown in Oklahoma, and they're growing a ton of it, is controlled by Chinese gangs. So anyhow, Hal? Yeah.
You mentioned in Dallas anyway, I think I mentioned this before, but I think it's Centerpoint Church that's on 45 Martin Luther King on the northwest side. And it is very similar. He has about 3 or 4 blocks.
Yeah.
Similar sort of deal. And he will have 1, 2 gang-related deaths a week.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, if you look at this more globally, in European countries now particularly with various segments coming in, immigrants and so forth, there are areas, and you might not call it a gang, but where police and government officials will not go because there is total control. So to me, that is a gang. When a gang is predominantly kind of running things, you have that. So it's a big deal.
A friend of ours was in Mexico and came back and we were talking to him. There are 60 cartels in Mexico now.
Yeah.
And it's the same way.
Yeah.
Your cartel in your area controls what
Yeah.
goes on in the area.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the only time you really get in trouble is if you do something wrong or you get caught in a crossfire at the border of the 2 cartels.
Yeah, exactly. So this idea of gangs, and we'll talk about it, we'll even abstract it up in a little bit, is dysfunctional groups working together to exclude and kill others is a prevalent and growing things in our society. And technology and globalization have further enabled it because it's easier to be in a group now and communicate and all that than it once was. So a number of us, some of us in this room went to hear Father Boyle speak about a month ago over at Jesuit. And I believe the number, he says he's buried about 250. I believe the number he said there, someone correct me, was he just buried 287th gang member. That's someone that's associated with him and Homeboy Industries that was killed, gang-related violence. So it's really significant. So this idea of woundedness, as I say, gang members have it, but church members have it and families have it. We all have elements of gang-related behavior. That is where one group excludes and somehow attacks another, whether it's physically violent attack or whatever. So we're going to talk about the lessons at that level. I want to start though by sharing something, and I've shared this with some in this group. About 3 weeks ago, our daughter invited me to a preview of a film that they've made about Richard Rohr. And it's a 45-minute kind of documentary. And he shared some, and it's not been released yet. I think it's about to be released. But he shares in that, it's a very kind of plain vanilla kind of documentary about him. But one of the stories he shares, it shows where he lives, and he lives at this center, and there's a church right next door. And he shares about that over time, there was an AA, Alcoholics Anonymous group, that met there and that still meets there. And that on breaks, smoke breaks and so forth, they would be right outside his house. And so he over time went out there and got to know some of the members of Alcoholics Anonymous and so forth, and got to know them well enough. They invited him to come to a meeting, so forth and so on. And he said, you know, in looking at Alcoholics Anonymous, he said, the entrance into Alcoholics Anonymous is by people who have recognized that they are about something that is wrong. There's wrongness in something about them. And he said, I got to thinking about that. And he said, it's an interesting contrast to how the church is perceived, because the church is perceived that that's a group that the entrance is of people who are focused on being right. And he says, on reflecting on it, I think Alcoholics Anonymous is a better model for the church, people who have done something who are wrong, than is the church, who's often perceived as right. And he makes the comment out of all of that. He says, you know, I've looked at all of that, and I really believe that woundedness is the doorway. That woundedness is the doorway. And as I thought about, and as I've studied Father Boyle's book on gangs, it's interesting that the entrance into Homeboy Industries and to their interactions is people who are kind of into the rope, who have recognized something really wrong in their life. And so it occurs to me that we often would do so much to avoid the things that are wrong in our lives, and yet so often what's wrong in our life is in fact the doorway. So with that kind of as the model, our woundedness is the doorway. I think one of the big problems of the church is, the great thing about the church is we have aspirational standards. We have a relationship with God, and we have a great desire to do right. The big challenge of the church is we really struggle to live up to our standards. That's the gap between what we would be, what we aspire to be, and as a church and as individuals, what we really are. And you know, Anne Lamont's famous statement that things are deteriorating faster than I can lower my standards. So we struggle with that gap and the reality that we face. And there's moments in our lives when we think we're kind of on top of it. And then there's moments in our life where we say, whatever standard I had, we've just totally blown that one up. So I want to start out, and I've got 12 quotes from this book. I don't know how far I'll get. And I don't know that I'll get finished with the book, and that's okay. But I want to just start with this is kind of emblematic of some of his stories. One of the things he does a lot is he speaks a lot, and he virtually always takes one or two homeboys or homegirls with him on these trips. So this is one of those trips. I take two identical twins, Gus and Victor, to Sacramento. When they were younger and carousing around in the projects, I really was bad at telling them apart. It's somewhat easier now since Gus has a decided limp. He had his leg shot off and now sports a prosthetic leg. We're traveling in the early days of post 9/11. We're at Burbank Airport and the TSA are just getting the kinks out of the system. These guys have no IDs, of course, and in those days, any ID worked. So we made the homeboy employee ID cards as IDs. The twins look like their employer might be the Taliban. I walked through security without a problem. Victor gets the wand treatment, since frankly, he looks like Central Casting asked him to go to the airport to play the role of gang members. But Gus, however, sets off every bell like when you win the car at the slot machines at Vegas. I watch as the agent takes him away from the others. I also watch as his blood pressure rises and he gets increasingly agitated with this guy. I have a fake leg, he yells. And well, everyone turns around and looks. I try to signal to him that he ought to take things down a notch. Finally, the agent is done with him. But as he saunters away, it is clear that Gus is not done with him. Do we look like terrorists? I mean, come on, we're gang members. Gus actually believed this would be comforting to hear. The moment comes when we get to trade in the God who would like us to get our act together, or to look or act differently, or to be rid of our shameful past for the God who only wants to hand us joy. And there's just so many stories like this, and we're going to cover some of them. But it reminds me, let me take it from a gang example to a family example. So Soren, our grandson, 2 weeks ago, he goes to Sunday school down there and they have the time in the atrium. Well, I was a little late getting down there, and that was 2 weeks ago. And on the way home, he announced kind of rather proudly that he'd eaten 6 cookies. And so Linda and I say, 6 cookies, that might be a little more, that might be a little over the top. Let's see if we can't ratchet that back. So last Sunday, I'm late getting down there and he's circling the cookie table, and Ellen and Tom Beam are there. So he gets a cookie every time he goes around the table. And when I show up, he has a chocolate chip. And the next thing I know, he's got an Oreo. And so I say to Soren, Soren, how many cookies have you had? He said, not 6. I've only had 4 or 5. And I think that's so emblematic of all of us. And whether it's the things we deal with in terms of disagreements or whatever, that we both often condemn ourselves. In fact, I think the quote is, in defending and exalting ourselves and who we are, we incriminate ourselves. But at the same time, God understands it all. He gets it all. So Boyle's stories are of extreme woundedness, and they're jolting, they're instructive, they're humanizing. He uses stories the way Jesus uses stories and parables. He says people hope for our attention, not our opinions. Arguments don't change minds, stories do. And he uses humor, and I think the way he uses it particularly takes the mask off. It reveals the truth. It often, I think, unstacks the hierarchy. A warning, some of the stories are salty. The language is salty, it's earthy, it's real. So if you're offended by that, I'm going to read through it the way it's written. And it is true for that culture and so forth. So, Hal, were you going to say?
Yeah, I had a guy that, got his law degree that worked for me, and he was working for the public defender's office downtown, and he would tell all these stories about exactly what we're talking about. I remember one of them, he said, the guy was accused of stealing like $200, and he gets before the judge, says, oh, that's a lie, it was only $37.50.
Exactly, exactly. And aren't we all doing that in some form or fashion? So just a bit of a warning. And my goal is really to get you to read the book in a group, 2 or more. So it's so valuable when you can read this and discuss it with others, but it's also great if you're unable to do that. So in his introduction, there's a couple things he says. He talks about what he means by the whole language. And let me just read that what he says about that. The mystical kinship, this speaking the whole language, is the exact opposite of the age in which we currently live. Tribal, divisive, suspicious, anchored in the illusion of separation, unhealthy, sad, fearful, otherizing, and demonizing. Mystics replace fear with love, vindictiveness with open-heartedness and kindness, envy with supportive affection, withering judgment with extravagant tenderness. Now is the time, as author Brian Doyle suggests, to embrace something other than combat. Just think that is such a pithy statement, a time for us to embrace something other than combat. A mystic wants to imagine a world without prisons, for example, then set out to create that world. Prisons, after all, are where we practice exclusion. As Pope Francis says, the only future worth building includes everyone. At Homeboy Industries, we long to see deeply, to see homies in their soul fullness. We want to see beyond rap sheets and past behavior, beyond tattoos and trauma. We want to see the mystical wholeness of the other. God sees this way. Jesus sees this way. We want to see this way. The poet Rumi writes, where am I going on this glorious journey? To your house, of course. This house we create will be filled with acceptance, non-judgment, and peace. Refining how we will love in this house will always be a good use of our time. A homie, Sergio, told me once, we need to fan the flames of tenderness in each other. Once we are reached by tenderness, we become tenderness. And I think we can relate this clearly to gangs, but we can relate this in our own lives of those people we struggle with, those people who in their behavior and how they've treated us, how they've wounded others, just like gang members. We have trouble seeing the wholeness of them. And each of us, if we had time in here, could come up with an example of someone you've written off, someone you just couldn't stand, someone you were repelled by. And something happened that opened up something, and there was tenderness there that elicited something out of you. And in this book, you're going to get more of the kind of the grace side. There is no ignoring the awful things that have gone on. And it's not that there's not an issue around accountability. And because I just have to say, when I read this book, I think of Linda, because and all that have worked at places like Interfaith, because people have made horrible decisions. They've done awful things, and they do them again, and they disappoint. So it's not about glossing over that's not real. But when he talks about the whole language, the whole person, is the ability to see, in spite of that, and we all have some of that, that there's a wholeness, there's other parts that also come to play. And our job is to try to find that. And he eloquently deals with that over and again. Yes. 2020, I believe. I'll look, I believe it's 2020. it was written, he talks about COVID, 2021. So, he will refer in some of this to COVID. So this was fairly recent. We have become more like gangs and mobs in our society. The last piece I written was on mobs, how we've become mob-like, not just in gangs, but in government, in politics, in school boards, in churches, mobs that form. So it's not like we can say, oh, that's those folks in LA. That's all of us. And part of one of the statements he makes is the holiness of second chances. Our whole idea of redemption is the holiness of second chances. And, you know, when you think about Peter's question, how many times, it's actually not second chances, it's third and fourth and 60 and 70 and 77. So this idea of chances, which is so important for others, and it's so important for us because just like anyone else, we need second and third and fourth chances. So he says, at Homeboy Industries, we have a commitment to demonize no one. Talking about the power and the possibility of redemption. To be the front porch of the house we all long to live in. To be the front porch of the house. For each of us to be the front porch of the house we all long to live in. Homies who run the place say we are saved by relationships. And he will make the point, and I'll cover this later on, is it is the relationships that are so redeeming in what's going on there. Homeboy Industries chooses connection, not perfection. And how about each of us? Where in our lives are we seeking perfection from someone when we really need a higher goal, and that is connection? And it doesn't mean there's not bad stuff going on, but that idea of connection is a higher thing than perfection. So, chapter 1, you're here. And the question is, how do we think about God? What, in our mind, what is God? I would think each of us has a different perception. He says, nothing is more consequential in our lives than the notion of God we hold. Not God, the notion of God. Because none of us fully get it. In fact, we don't come close. So what's our notion of God? This is what steers the ship. Teresa of Avila says, all concepts of God are like a jar we break. I love that statement. So we have a perception of God, and then life happens. And we change it a little bit. We don't know why others don't get it. And then something else happens, and the jar breaks. Our conception of God, it seems to me, if we're growing in our faith, is a jar that's constantly broken as we draw closer and as we get there. So he starts out, let me find it, in this chapter, sharing what happened in his life. So here's where he starts out, and he's talking about he's among 8 kids. So he's got 7 brothers and sisters. Here's what he says, and he's talking about his mom as she was nearing death. And she was not a lick afraid of dying. Some 3 weeks before she died, she said to me, giddy and accelerated, I've never done this before. It was something you'd say about skydiving. In fact, the day before she died, I was alone with her, the rarest of things. She was asleep. When her eyes opened and she saw me there, she scowled. Oh, for crying out loud. And she closed her eyes. She was pissed. That wasn't that she wasn't dead yet. But the next day, my sisters went out to retrieve lunch, and I was alone with her again, sitting at the foot of the bed. Exactly noon, she opened her eyes, lifting her head some, let out a glorious, wondrous gasp, like skydiving, and she left us. And no one in earshot of the sound would ever fear death again. During those weeks, one of the 2 or 3 or 6 of her kids would keep vigil around her bed, and she'd be in and out of consciousness. And when she came to, she'd lock onto one of us and say with breathless delight, "You're here. You're here." After we buried her, I recall this and grew convinced this may well be the singular agenda item of our God, to look at us with breathless delight and say, "You're here. You're here. You're here." What a wonderful image. And we get that. We get that as parents, and we get that as kids, and we get that as followers of Jesus Christ. So it's just interesting. He goes on to say this idea of inclusiveness and that we're all valuable. Imagine a big old net ready to catch you. At Homeboy, we use the concept of being held, reflective of the God who will not drop us, pulling out the chair beneath your mind and watching you fall upon God. I love that last phrase, pulling out the chair beneath your mind, all the head work, all being in our head, and watching you fall upon God. If God makes us feel unworthy and in debt, wrong God. If God frightens us, wrong God. If God is endlessly disappointed, wrong God. And he talks about, one of the examples he uses in there is that when the wise men that came to see Jesus and left by a different path? He said, that's what we're doing, is we come one way and leave by a different path, leave by a different way. A homie says to me, I see now that I have never made it easy for my parents to love me, and yet they never stopped loving me. There's a statement that I've used in one of my writings, that the statement is that all the child really wants to see is their parents' eyes light up when they walk in a room. You're here. That's the relationship with God. God roots for us more than he calls the shots. He's the parent. It's just like parents and kids. We don't get to call all the shots, what happens to our kids, but we do root for them every step of the way. So this idea of earning versus receiving love. Let me go to the next quote here. Spooky, a 16-year-old homie, walks into my office and asks, "You want me doing nothing?" I thank him and say, "I have plenty of people doing nothing already, thank you." He shifts to small talk and he asks me, "Hey G," that's what he calls him. "Hey G, you ever win the Nobel Peace Prize?" I laugh and tell him no. He scrunches his face and says sympathetically, "Haven't did enough?" I tell him that I'm sure that's it. And yes, the God who thinks we hadn't did enough is the wrong God too small. My friend, Marabia Starr, a mystic who writes about mystics, says, once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods. It is always hard for us to believe in the non-judgmental, loving, and merciful God, and yet that is the God we actually have. The whole God. The whole God. Not just the part of the God. And yes, rules, and when we do bad things to others, it hurts people, and that hurts God and all that. But the whole God, the whole person that we become and look at. Here's the good news. The God we mostly want is the God we actually have, and the God we fear is, in fact, the partial God we've settled for. So God is to us, you're here, like Boyle's mom each time she awoke and one of the kids was there. So let me go to the next reading about the heart. Gloria's bumper sticker on her car, I suppose, was a window to how she saw herself. It read, "You say I'm a bitch, like that's a bad thing?" A tough cookie of a homegirl, Gloria navigated more abuse, violence, and sheer abandonment in her lifetime than most. The first person she met at Homeboy was one of our senior staff, Mary Ellen Burton. Gloria marveled at her kindness. She welcomed me like she was waiting for me. Gloria's periodic bouts with addiction would visit her like some very unwelcome relative. Once she walked in my office so smoked out, it took my breath away, and she deflected it with, "I've lost so much weight, I look like a wet food stamp." It was during this period, when the darkness was hugely enveloping, that she stood by herself, peered over a bridge overpass, and indeed contemplated seeing her body sprawled at the bottom. Just as this seemed feasible, a car passed and a guy on the passenger side leaned out the window and yelled, "Just jump already." Gloria turned with a quickness and a fury, "Fuck you, motherfucker." And the whole moment jolted her into what she later told me was a useful anger. Then she howled with laughter on the bridge, as we both would later in my office at the telling of it. Part of Gloria's return to self came with an admission and a revelation. When I walked through these doors, I didn't have a heart, she told me. I had a rock. I wanted to cover my pain instead of feel it. Now I can feel it, and it's a beautiful thing. Once when she was working at Homeboys and close to the near wholeness of herself, she shared a dream she'd had the night before. She told me in her dream she's dancing with God, and folks, more important and more valuable people, keep trying to cut in, and God won't let them. She said this, and our eyes met like never before, and they moistened. We sat in silence at an image of a God so perfect. And she's a harsh example. And the question is, where in our lives, what part of our heart is a rock? What part of it has lost feeling? What part of it is unable to interact with someone else because that rock portion, that hard portion is there? He refers to a passage I love, the worries that there won't be enough God to go around. The worries that with my behavior, there's not enough God to deal with what I've done wrong. He says we don't measure up, we show up. Notice over and again how he talks about the relational nature of God. He says, and Richard Rohr talks about all the counting and the performance and the perfection and so forth, when what God most wants is to show up so he then can make us more perfect. When we try doing it ourselves, it doesn't work well. So this idea that our first job is to show up and then let God help us. At Starbucks, they never say, "May I help you?" but rather, "What can I get started for you?" God asks the same question. We want to be curious about our distress rather than terrified. Curious versus judgmental. This idea, I love this idea that "may I help you" comes at it from healer, unhealed. What do we do to get started is engagement. God is wanting us to be more engaged. And then out of that comes the success, the healing. He makes this question, prayer doesn't work, praying does. Notice the noun versus the verb. And he uses that a couple of times in here, that it is the engagement and that is the most powerful part of prayer. Some of our prayers are answered. Some of our prayers, thank God, aren't answered. We never quite know, but praying is a guarantee. That praying is what's powerful. It's the old thing, I think it was Eisenhower, plans don't work, planning works. This idea of process, that being engaged with God. God dances toward us. God runs like the prodigal father. He talks about that willingness to be on our level. And then we get to this one. This is one of my favorites, and it's just, I hope you're not offended. We always need to abandon performance when it comes to God and walk instead in the arms of the encounter. Sure, the floor is uneven, but our self-improvement resolution should be jettisoned since they keep us from dancing. They keep us from dancing. The arms of encounter are held out by the tender one who wants us to gravitate in the direction. Joel and another homie took their first plane trip with me, ate food requiring bibs at Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, and shared their stories before a gym filled with high school Catholic boys. High school Catholic boys, remember that. I'd heard of Joel's story several times at that point in our trip. I noticed the detour he took in the middle of his presentation. So Joel is presenting this group of boys. So here's where Joel breaks his presentation, and here's where he goes. So there I was. This is Joel talking at home, talking to all these boys, cleaning my bathroom. And as I was scrubbing the sink, Marvin Gaye is singing on the radio. Let's get it on. You know the song. Joel began to sing. Let's get it on. The gym exploded in hollering and raucous laughter with all these boys. Without a shred of inhibition, he repeated his singing of the line and added a kind of a shuffle dance. Let's get it on. The packed room could not be contained. Then Joel began to speak other lines from the song, and the boys grew quiet. Don't you know what I'm dreaming? Don't you know what I'm dreaming of? That's the verse. Don't you know how sweet and wonderful life can be? That's part of the verse. He paused and communicated with certainty that the story was now downshifting to a slower, deeper velocity. Joel again. I realized it was God dropping me a hint. Tears down his cheek as they did at dinner the night before. This was not lost on the audience, and they were completely still. Back to the lyrics. Ain't going to worry, won't push you, baby. If you believe in love, Joel continued, then let's get it on. His crying now was just this side of derailing the entire speech. The gym was absolutely hushed. And Joel concluded. So, remember he was cleaning the bathroom. I said yes. I surrendered to the love, to God. Yes, let's get it on. He stopped there. Echoing applause punctuated this story's end. You'll never hear Marvin Gaye sing that song again without this context. This idea of let's get it on. Let's be in relationship. Let's be fully engaged. It's just incredible the context that Joel brought to that song. And so it's just, he concludes his chapter saying, the tender one keeps trying to rearrange our thinking. We keep being led to the utter fullness of our hearts aligned with this one tender heart. This one is sorry we go through what we do. You're here, God says, holding us in the bleachers. We can rest in that. Might add, let's get it on. So this idea of how precious we're viewed and how powerful is the relationship, just blows me away. Anybody else? Okay, so we're chapter 2. Who are we? What's our identity? What's God's view? How's that all viewed? Let me just start out with this. A homie I met in camp expressed a common lament. I mean, my dad just doesn't get me. He does not understand me. I mean, he thinks I'm good. How easy it is to believe and invest in our own impoverished identity. to believe that the injured self, whatever our injured self are, we all have part of us that are injured, to believe that our injured self is who we are. We never want to be who we are. Yet what one doesn't become noble, we locate our nobility. It's there. It's not that we become it. It's already there. God is in us. Our nobility is in it. And our job with God is to locate it. The hard part is embracing our inner nobility, beauty, and goodness. Unfortunately, so often for all of us, it is the frightened, damaged self that takes center stage. We can all relate to that, those moments in our lives when we've allowed that to be who we are in the center stage. We can learn to catch ourselves. So we probably can't avoid it. We can learn to catch ourselves. The homies think this is their truth. They get caught in the downward spiral and repetitious cycle of unworthiness and shame. The flip side of this is developing a positive facility for a different way to define oneself in donation rather than deficit, to define ourselves as donation rather than deficit. It's not that they have forgotten their original goodness, but they have never been properly introduced to it. And in some ways, neither have we. No matter how far we journey, no matter how our faith, there are times when we have to be reintroduced to the God that sees us different, more aspirational, better than we do. And it's also a God who is so pained, he'll talk about it later, by the bad choices we make and the ways that we do things. So it's not about disavowing that. It's just saying, is there a higher, better way? And so how easy it is to believe or invest in our impoverished identity. And I like that idea of investing in our impoverishment. What are the ways we actually invest in it as opposed to de-invest? It's never been properly introduced. We never say to homies, we believe you can change. Rather, we know you can heal. You know, so much of what we deal with, and he talks about this, is around the behavioral side, which means if we could just get the behavior right, we could fix it. But the underlying wound, if we don't allow God to be a part of healing that, then the chances of what Richard Rohr calls sin management aren't great. We want to hold the wounded and the person who did the wounding because we are always both. Judgment is blind. It only love truly sees, and only an understanding heart speaks the whole language. We never know the whole story, and we never see the whole person, not in ourselves and not in others. So I just go back to that idea that the part of us that's broken, the part of us that is not working, the unhealed part is where God works, and that's where the powerful stuff comes. So the question you ask is, what is love? What is it? Let me read that. So he's at let me move on to that. Okay. So we find our true selves in loving in the verb of it. Matthew 25, he talks about the original context of the widow, orphan, and stranger was the ones we can live without. That's the separateness of those. And so we know as Christians in Matthew 25, we're to deal with the ones who are the least of these. But one of the questions you ask in our circle today, of those that we know, of those that we interact with, in our family, in our church, who are the ones we've decided that we can live without, that don't really have a place at the table? He says, the singular sin of the world failed to see with God's eyes, to see goats when really we are all just sheep. We have goat behavior, we have elements of goat, but in God's eyes, aspirationally, we're all sheep. So I find my soul clapping hands for your soul more than my own. Clapping, our souls clapping hands. I think of that, of clapping hands for that person I really struggle with. Clapping hands for that person that has wounded me and therefore I want to stay away from. God doesn't want anything from us, only for us. That is such a profound statement. We don't disappoint God because he says, oh my, I'm so disappointed. We disappoint God because he says, I wanted more for you. I wanted it better for you. I want this for you. And so we get now to this. This is at Pelican Bay State Prison. Here's the story. So he's been there and he's spoken there, and he says, after Mass, inmates pose with me. 1, 4, sometimes groups of 12 or more. I meet a guy named Louis with every inch of his face covered in tattoos, a calling card for seriously traumatized human being. Tattoos like this all over his face can often be a keep away sign meant to keep all comers guessing as to the mental stability of the tattooed one. Louis has all day, which means he ain't ever getting out of prison, and he will never leave prison alive. He's goofy and charming and not at all off-putting. He becomes the phantom, ever-present photobomber. He manages to insinuate himself into every picture. Though never invited, he steps into the shot and no one rebuffs him. He's just a tender part of the scenery. As Sam and Sam's the guy, he's kind of taking care of him at the prison, and I walk from the gym after Mass, I mention Louis and laugh about our intrepid photobomber. Sam tells me that some months earlier, he had planned a concert by Eric Genius. Eric had performed at Carnegie Hall and later at Homeboy. He plays the piano and has a couple of others who accompany on strings. Sam had gotten permission for 200 inmates to attend, but only 60 showed up, and Sam was a bit disappointed. He had planned to play for 45 minutes and then engage in a question and answer session for 15 minutes. He began to play, and something descended on the folks gathered in that same gym that I had noticed when I'd celebrated the Eucharist. There was a reverent stillness thick in the air. Inmates and guards alike were held in the music's spell. It was the most glorious thing Sam had ever witnessed at Pelican Bay Prison. He looked at the prisoners, and soon they were all sobbing. He saw that the guards were discreetly flicking tears. The magnificent music had detonated some release so welcome and so unexpected. Eric finished and turned to his stunned audience and asked if there were any questions. There was only silence for some time. Then Louis, our photobomber, rose, had something to say, but he was crying so hard, it was momentarily a struggle for him. It was a struggle for him to locate his question. He could only utter one word. Why? Eric, the musician, began to cry as well and said, because you are deserving. You are worthy of beauty and music. And because there's no difference between you and me. And here, I suppose, is the faith that saves. When we are anchored in love, registered to as sustaining God, and ever mindful of our undeniable goodness. That's why. And it occurs to me that what God does over and again for us is reminds us of what he sees us as our potential. And then the hard part, and he loves everyone, and every other person thinks they have the same potential we do, including those we cannot stand. That's the deal. We're all in. Because you are deserving, you are worthy of beauty and music. And because there's no difference between you, Boyle says we all weigh the same. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we all weigh the same. Seeing as God sees. I'm going to take just 3 more minutes and we'll wrap up. Yet we try to see as God does, we notice how unwell and damaged people are, and they just can't get at their goodness. Whole in health are what holiness is about. People are strangers to their own goodness. We don't have homies. We don't save homies, we see them. They are used to being watched. An inmate at Newell Creek said, "I was violent so people would see me." We see in today's world so much of the aberrant behavior, and technology allows it even more, of people trying to be seen, how do we replace the God who wants us to get our act together for the God who just wants to get it on? God is never confused, can only see himself in you. Goodness is our pre-existing condition. God made us with a pre-existing condition. No boogeyman just separated from ourselves. We are relationally separated. And I'll conclude with this final story. Nikki showed up for work. This is at Homeboys, wearing this wild and brightly colored pajama top. I flagged him into my office. "Hey, dog, you do know that's a pajama top, don't you?" No beat is missed. "No, it ain't. It's the cops won't mess with me if I'm wearing it shirt." God and splendor shaking hands. So we'll pick up next time on chapter 3 and get as far as we can. But what I would ask for us to think about this next week is 2 parts. One, we're not terrorists, we're gang members. That's all of us, and that's our excuse. And then the second part is, in this book and the others, there's such powerful examples of God's ability to claim people who have done heinous things, and we'll get a little bit more into some of the things they've done, awful things, and carry not only the guilt of the wound of the other, but the wound it is put on them for doing it. And we all can relate to that. And the question is, we're not in a gang in LA, but we're in families. We work, we're in churches, we're in social groups. Where does this apply to me? Let us close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're thankful for these insights and the way you touch not just our mind, but our heart. Help us this next week to think about our role in our gangs and how we deal with other gangs and how it wounds them and how it wounds us. Help us to make space in our heart, O Lord, for you to soften the rocks. In your name we pray. Amen. Happy to discuss anything. I just know I'm out of time. Anybody got any questions or comments? Anything? Thanks.
Thank you.